S- s- Okay, we're now recording. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. It is my great pleasure today to bring to the University of California Irvine Law School a distinguished author and Richard Rothstein, who has written a monumentally significant book about housing segregation in the United States, The Color of Law. As the book has won accolades from people who have studied poverty in this country. It has won accolades from constitutional scholars such as Geoffrey Stone of the University of Chicago. I think one of the things that I most appreciated about the book was that Richard did not simply go after the easy targets parts of the country where there was housing segregation. He went after places that you probably would not have necessarily thought were where there was a lot of housing segregation, such as San Francisco Bay Area and the area around Harvard University. I just wanted to say one other thing. I can't say that I know Richard terribly well, but I have admired him for many years. When I first met Richard, he was one of the most important labor organizers in the United States, doing work for the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers on behalf of low-income garment workers in the South, and then later in California. And then at a certain point, Richard shifted gears, not in terms of, I guess what I'd say was his broad goal of making the world a better place, but he shifted gears as to how he was going to do that. Moving into writing and research. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Richard Rothstein. Welcome to the University of California Irvine Law School. We're happy to have you.
Thank you. And thank you, Henry, whom I met when you were a reporter at the Los Angeles Times, covering labor.
Right.
The labor reporter at the LA Times, yeah. Well, thanks all of you for engaging in this with me this afternoon. I'm going to try to be as brief as I can because I hope to get as much time as questions and discussion from you as possible. But the underlying context of what I'm going to talk to you about today is that in the 1960s, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It actually began in the 1930s with challenging segregation in law schools. That's where civil rights litigators began. And then that precedent was used to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, in Brown versus Board of Education, they abolished legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. You know all this, but that Brown decision gave impetus and inspiration to an activist movement that engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience, and people lost their lives. And that movement eventually persuaded much of the country, not everybody, that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, and it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. And with that understanding, with militant but nonviolent tactics, that movement succeeded in the 1960s in abolishing segregation in public accommodations and public transportation, trivial, seemingly things like water fountains and swimming pools. And in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, succeeded in getting a Fair Housing Act passed that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But yet, the civil rights movement then ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. All that I lived in have been clearly defined areas of white, all white, or clearly defined areas that were all black or mostly black. I mean, how could it be that the civil rights movement understood that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy, and yet we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, Partly it's because it's hard to undo racial segregation of neighborhoods. If we pass an ordinance prohibiting discrimination in restaurants or transportation, buses, next day you go to any restaurant you want, sit anywhere you want in that restaurant. Next day you can ride in on any bus and sit anywhere you want on the bus. But if we pass an ordinance prohibiting segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, Northerners, Southerners, Democrats, Republicans, is we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for not doing something about the fact that we're an apartheid society when it comes to neighborhoods. And the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregations that we abolished in the 20th century, like public accommodations or transportation or schools and colleges, that was all done by government. The federal government was doing it. It was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, a civil rights violation that we as American citizens have an obligation to fix. State and local governments were doing it. It was a violation of the 14th Amendment, something we equally have an obligation to fix. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. Wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. That just sort of happened accidentally, naturally. It happened because bigoted white homeowners or landlords refused to rent or sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or maybe businesses like banks and realtors and construction companies and developers discriminated in how they carried out their private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's really just because blacks and whites like to live with each other of the same race. They feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe we tell ourselves that it's all the result of economic differences. African Americans have lower incomes on average than whites, and so many African Americans can't afford to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, but private sector actions, self-choice, income differences is what's created residential segregation. We give a name to this rationalization. We say what we've got is de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, not in law. And we tell ourselves that if it happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. Most of us think it's too bad. We live in, as I say, an apartheid society, a segregated society, but we don't feel any obligation to do anything about it. Well, I spent many years before I got engaged in writing this book, The Color of Law, writing about education policy. I was the education columnist at the New York Times for a while and wrote about education policy for think tanks. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I spent much of my time criticizing the dominant educational theory of the country at that time. And that theory was that African American children, on average, had lower achievement than white children. We called it an achievement gap. And the reason we had an achievement gap, we told ourselves, was because teachers have low expectations of Black children. They just don't try very hard. And we came up with this idea. I thought it was a crazy idea that if only we could make teachers try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. So I say this was a belief across the political spectrum. Republicans and Democrats joined together to enact in 2001 a law called the No Child Left Behind Act, which required annual testing of children and hold teachers and schools accountable for those children's test scores, with the prediction that in 7 years there'd be no more achievement gap if only we hold teachers' feet to the fire. Well, it's now some 20 years after that, and the achievement gap is not much different than it was in 2001. The law was another failure. All it succeeded in doing is getting schools teaching disadvantaged children to abandon a well-rounded curriculum and focus only on drills on math and reading so that they can get higher test scores. But it didn't accomplish what it set out to do. And the reason it didn't accomplish what it set out to do is because its theory was flawed. Of course, there are some teachers with low expectations, some teachers who are lazy and don't try very hard. But that's not the reason we have an achievement gap. That's a small part of the explanation. The reason we have an achievement gap is because so many African American children coming from poverty backgrounds come to school with social and economic disadvantages that impede their ability to take advantage of what even the best schools have to offer. And I remember writing one column in the Times about asthma. As you may know, African American children in low income neighborhoods have asthma at about 4 times the rate of middle class children in higher opportunity communities. 4 times the rate. It's an enormous difference. And the reason they have asthma is because at such high rates is because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more trucks driving through their neighborhoods, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, uh, more empty lots kicking up dust. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely, not necessarily, but more likely than a child without asthma, to be up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children, this is a simple statistical proposition that you all can understand. If you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial composition, same social and economic background, same family structure, same economic circumstances, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement by a small amount, simply from being sleepier. Well, it is a small amount, but then you begin to think of all of the other conditions that have a similar impact on achievement. Lead poisoning, measurable impact on IQ. Homelessness, children have no place to work and study. Economic insecurity, overcrowding. You go through all of these, and after a while, you attribute a little bit of the achievement gap to each of them, and you've explained the achievement gap by the time you're finished, leaving very little explanation to teacher expectations. Well, I began to realize it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. What happens when you have a school where every child has one or more of these conditions? How can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come well rested, in good health, well nourished from economically secure homes? No matter how many laws you pass, you can't have that realistic expectation. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they have been at any time in the last 45 years in this country. And the reason they're so segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was an educational issue, something schools should be concerned about. And that's how I came to the topic of this book, The Color of Law. Well, these are the lines in which I was thinking. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that I assume some of you at least are familiar with. In 2007, the Supreme Court evaluated a program of 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of them had a trivial school desegregation plan. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to intensify segregation, it would not be honored in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't. So if you had an all white or mostly white school and both a black and a white child applied for the last place in that school, the black child would be given some preference. Trivial program. But the Supreme Court evaluated it, denounced it. The controlling opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He said you couldn't do such a thing. He said it's true the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated, but he said the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. That's why you have school segregation. He was right about that. And then he went on to say that those neighborhoods are segregated de facto for the reasons I described before: private bigotry, actions of private businesses, self-choice, self-segregation, income differences. And he said, we have de facto segregation, something that government was not responsible for. It's against the Constitution. It's a violation of the Constitution for the government explicitly to do anything to fix it. Well, I read this decision, and I recalled reading about something that happened some years before in Louisville, Kentucky, one of these 2 school districts. In an all-white suburb of Louisville called Shively, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home. The suburb was all single-family homes. The white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and child, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in Shively and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, there was a mob of white residents who surrounded the home, protected by the police. The mob threw rocks through the windows. The police made no attempt to stop this. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to restrain them. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the courts, the prosecutors are all mobilized in an attempt to enforce racial boundaries in Louisville, and I began to look into it further, and I found, and I'm not exaggerating here, there were hundreds and hundreds of cases across the country in the self-satisfied smug places that Professor Weinstein just mentioned, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, New York, Detroit, Chicago, Denver, Kansas City, all over, of police-protected, frequently police-led and organized mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these, where the police was involved in either protecting, organizing, or leading the mob, was a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment, that we as American citizens had an obligation to redress and never have done. Well, I began to look into it further, and I found that there were many, many federal, state, and local policies. It wasn't just police-protected violence, state-sponsored violence that created segregation. Many racially explicit public policies designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of the country. I think I have time maybe to describe one of the more powerful ones, but in my book, The Color of Law, I describe many, many of these kinds of policies. The one I'll focus on in the few minutes that we have today is a program of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the post-World War II period, when millions of returning war veterans were coming home needing housing, to move the entire white working class and middle class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. It was a racially explicit program. At the time, remember, this is immediately after World War II, we were not a suburban country. The suburbanization took place largely as a result of this federal program. The only people who were living in suburbs at the time were affluent people. We were a manufacturing economy. Factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals. So if you had a factory district that was employing both black and white workers, or even the employees of banks that were servicing them and other middle class services, it had to be located in that same downtown district. So we had broadly integrated neighborhoods. We'd be stunned if we were transported back in that period of time to see the extent of residential segregation and integration, rather, that existed. Well, the federal government embarked on a program to move the whites out of those neighborhoods and prohibit African Americans from joining them. You're familiar with all of these projects. I don't know, maybe you're from Southern California, you know Lakewood or Westchester or the Panorama City, or the East Coast. Perhaps the most famous of them is Levittown, east of New York City. These developers who created these projects could never have assembled a capital to buy the land and build these projects on their own. Levittown, for example, east of New York City, that I focus on a lot in the book, was 17,000 homes. But Lakewood and Westchester and Southern California, about the same size. No bank would be crazy enough to lend the developer of these projects the money to buy the land and build these homes. They thought it was a crazy idea. We were in a suburban country. The banks didn't think anybody would want to move to these places. The only way that these developers could get the bank loans to buy the land and build the projects was to go to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting their plans for the development, the architectural design, the layout of the streets, the materials they were going to use, and a commitment required by the Federal Housing and Veterans Administration never to sell a home to an African American. The FHA and VA even required these developers, like William Levitt in Levittown outside New York, or like David Bohannon or Mark Taper, you may know the name of a developer who created Lakewood. The only way they could get these loans was by going to the FHA and VA and getting them to guarantee their bank loans with those commitments. Well, they did. They built these projects. They were inexpensive homes for whites only. This was not the policy of rogue bureaucrats working in the FHA and VA. It was written out in a policy manual of the FHA, the underwriting manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not recommend these developers for federal bank guarantees. The underwriting manual said you could never do it if you were going to sell a home to an African American. The underwriting manual even said you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee in all white development if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. There's no basis in fact and reality to it whatsoever. We are a segregated society because of federal policies like this one. Well, the homes in these projects, these mid-20th century projects that were financed by the FHA in places like Levittown or Lakewood, Westchester, sold at the time inexpensive homes for working class families for about $7,000 to $8,000 a piece. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Any white or black family with a job in the post-war boom could have afforded a home for $100,000 with a long-term amortized mortgage. Veterans, white and black, if blacks were permitted to participate, made no down payment, and they could pay less than their monthly housing costs than they had been paying for rent in public housing prior to the suburbanization program. Well, as you know, homes in Levittown on the East Coast or Lakewood and Westchester on the West Coast no longer sell for $100,000. You can't buy one for $100,000. They now cost $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in some parts of the country, $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth because those homes appreciated in value. They gained wealth from the equity they gained as the homes appreciated. They used their wealth to send their children to college. They use it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, maybe medical, maybe unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit racial federal policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60% family incomes of white incomes. You would think that if African American family incomes were 60% of white family incomes, African American wealth would also be 60% of white wealth. You can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, while African American family incomes on average are about 60% of white family incomes, African American household wealth is about 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that has never been remedied, that we as a people have never accepted the obligation to remedy, which we're required to do under our Constitution. Well, the policies to remedy racial segregation, let me conclude with this. I can go into for hours and days and hours talking about other policies that were followed by federal, state, and local governments. But let me say the policies to remedy this are well known. It's no mystery. Journalists, housing experts, think tanks throw out policy ideas after policy ideas. What's missing is not policy ideas about how to fix it. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that is going to be as aggressive and militant and determined as the civil rights movement was in the 1960s, but now addressing the issue of residential segregation. I can mention a couple of the policies, and I'll conclude with that to show you how obvious they are. but for which there's no present political support. Um, I mentioned the creation of these suburbs, $100,000 homes in suburbs in the 20th century on a whites-only discriminatory basis. The federal government should be buying up homes in these suburbs at market rates, $300,000, $400,000, whatever they might be, and reselling them to qualified African Americans at deeply discounted rates as a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. I refer to it as an affirmative action policy in housing. And where there is a demonstrated past practice of discrimination, affirmative action is justified as a class remedy, much as we implemented affirmative action in hiring in industries where there was a demonstrated practice of previous discrimination. That's one policy we should be following. We're not doing it because there's no political support yet for doing it. Another policy, we have several programs that subsidize the housing costs of low-income families that reinforce segregation. The biggest one is something called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's a program of the U.S. Treasury Department that distributes tax credits via states to developers. The Treasury Department regulations place a premium on placing low-income housing tax credit units in existing low-income neighborhoods. It reinforces their segregation. That's crazy. We should be doing the opposite. It's not that we shouldn't be building better housing in low-income neighborhoods. We should, but we should also be building housing for low-income families who are disproportionately African American and Hispanic in high-opportunity communities, not placing a priority against doing so. Why don't we do that? Why don't we change those priorities? Well, one reason is there's no political support for it. And the other reason is that we have zoning laws in many high opportunity communities in this country, in California in particular, that require nothing but single family homes on large lot sizes be built in many areas of our communities. Those zoning laws, in my judgment, because they reinforce and maintain an unconstitutionally created segregation, are themselves subject to challenge. But until we change those zoning laws, it's not going to be easy to find locations where we can place housing units for low-income families or even from middle-class African-American families. African-American middle-class families live in much more segregated neighborhoods than they should. They live in neighborhoods with much greater poverty rates than white middle-class families with the same incomes. We need subsidies for those families to move to those kinds of communities from which they were historically excluded. So the policies, as I say, are well known. I was telling Professor Weinstein earlier, I'm now writing a new book about what we should do about it, describing some of these policies as well as describing how we can go about organizing a new civil rights movement in this country to make it uncomfortable not to adopt those policies. I don't know if Professor Weinstein wants to do this, but I can send you links to some of those articles that that are coming out of the work of from my book. I can send those to you. I can also send you a link to an organization that I'm working with. It's led by national civil rights and fair housing leaders to create something I call a new movement to redress racial segregation, whose role it will be to create and support local civil rights groups to address segregation in their own communities. One very easy thing that can be done by any of you who live in a community and have a few friends and associates who share an interest in this issue is take action to prevent your school districts from misteaching this history, from promoting the misleading idea of de facto segregation. In my book, The Color of Law, I devote some pages to examining the textbooks that are most commonly used in American high schools today to teach the history of racial inequity in this country, and they don't mention any of this. They brag about the great work that the Federal Housing Administration did in suburbanizing the country, never mentioning that it was for whites only. They talk about the great work that the New Deal did in building housing for workers who couldn't find it because we were in the Depression and no housing was being created. Never mentioning that it was always done on a segregated basis, creating separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Again, I can send you if you like, a link where you can get more information about this new movement to redress racial segregation. With that, I think I'll conclude, and hopefully I've left enough time for a lively
So Richard, please send me the links for the things you were referring to. I can get them. I can get them distributed to people. Sorry.
It's okay.
So the first question I want to read to you as a thoughtful question from one of my colleagues, who writes as follows: your project is thoroughly interesting and well supported, one that I appreciate and convinced by. I want to thank you for doing the hard work of bringing this project to public conversation. One question kept coming back to me was binary nature of the narrative, black and white, literally. I wondered about exclusion from story of other marginalized communities like Latinx, Native American, other ethnic groups, particularly but not exclusively in the western half of the United States. I suspect that, one second here, I suspect that the narrative you would offer is similar, certainly is the case of racially restricted covenant. I wonder if you might reflect on the choice to frame the book this way, and any thoughts that you have related to these, I'll call other disadvantaged communities.
Well, the policies that the federal government implemented in the 20th century were implemented at a time when the only minority that anybody was thinking about in the federal government were African Americans. Talk about the Latino and Hispanic families. They weren't distributed throughout the country. They were in the West Coast, and there were many state-sponsored policies, discrimination against them. And you could tell a similar story to some extent about them. But the federal government policies were directed specifically at the descendants of former slaves. And that's where the constitutional remedy is required. There are many other minority families today, low-income families, who are in neighborhoods of concentration because they're relatively recent immigrants. That's an entirely different phenomenon from someone who has been prohibited by public policy from accessing higher opportunity communities. Now, it's certainly true, as I said, that that in the West Coast, and particularly in California and Texas, and to some extent Colorado, there was a similar discrimination at the state level against people who came from Latin America. But it wasn't nearly as severe. And I'll give you one example. In California, there were these restrictive covenants that I mentioned. As you know, up until 1948, if a white homeowner sold a home to an African American and the home was covered by a restrictive covenant, neighbors could sue to have the African American evicted from the home that he had legitimately purchased. And by the way, if a white homeowner in an inner ring suburb, for example, in an all-white inner ring suburb, wanted to move or wanted to move to something, maybe he had a larger family, maybe he got a different job, it was in his interest to sell to an African American rather than to a white, because African Americans' housing supply was so small that they would pay more for similar housing than whites would pay, belying the notion that blacks moving into a community depressed property values. In fact, they increased property values until speculators came in and panicked whites into selling it below market. But when African Americans moved into a neighborhood, property values increased for that reason. Well, the restrictive covenants permitted neighborhoods to have families evicted if they were Hispanic or Black. in neighborhoods in California, but California courts ruled that they couldn't be enforced against Hispanics because they were Caucasians, and they could only be enforced against African Americans. So it's a different story. It's not one I focused on, but and certainly immigrant families and immigrant generations who are Latino faced to some extent discrimination, to some extent suffer from economic inequality. But it was not nearly as severe. The same thing could be said of Jews, for example, who were also covered by restrictive covenants. You may know the Lorraine Hansberry play about that that fact. But oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't the Lorraine Hansberry play. What is I'm thinking of something else. I'm thinking of a book by what's her name? I forget. There's a book about the Jews being forced out of a community because they bought in violation of Gentleman's Agreement, it was called. Laura Hobson. Takes me a while sometimes. But, you know, they ceased to be enforced against Jews long before they would continue to be enforced against African Americans. So I focus on African Americans for those reasons.
We've got one member audience would like you to, if you talk a bit about redlining.
Okay. Well, the term redlining comes from the fact that another federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s drew maps of metropolitan areas throughout the country where they recommended that it would be too risky for the federal government to get involved in insuring mortgages or extending credit to families. You know, the cover of my book, I can find one here. This is what these maps look like. Every metropolitan area, and that particular map on the cover is the map of the Newark, New Jersey area. And the areas where African Americans lived were colored red, indicating that it was imprudent for the federal government to guarantee mortgages or extend credit in those neighborhoods. And as a result, many banks followed these maps, and they couldn't get FHA insurance for mortgages that they issued, and so they didn't issue mortgages. African Americans who wanted to purchase homes in those neighborhoods, in many cities, they had to do something which we call buying on contract, which is like, it's really no different from renting, but they thought they were buying. They were buying on the installment plan where they accumulated no equity. And as a result, and the speculators who sold them these homes, because they had such a short housing supply, small housing supply, charged exorbitant prices for them. And because they couldn't get conventional mortgages, they had great difficulty with similar incomes from whites maintaining payments on these homes. So they doubled up, they subdivided them, and the neighborhoods deteriorated. That was the effect of redlining. Today, the term redlining is commonly used much more broadly, not only to describe the absence of investment in low-income Black neighborhoods, but what I was talking about before, the exclusion of African Americans from white neighborhoods. Those are really two different things, but we generally use the term redlining to describe both of them.
One of the members of the audience makes a comment about the perpetuation of some of the troubling zoning, if I understand the zoning practice you've referred to, saying that, you know, that it concentrates what are known as LULUs, locally unwanted uses, including while there are these lead smelters in low-income neighborhoods, such as East Los Angeles, a community I know that you're somewhat familiar with from the time that you spent here. And one would assume that that contributes to this achievement gap also, with people living in polluted neighborhoods, correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Now, another longer question here said that you made a reference that African-American incomes are about 60% of white incomes, and the process, I assume, this is explained in part by segregated communities, which result in segregated schools and thus the achievement gap. Are there any policies that could directly impact African-American impacts, or do you think it's more important to focus on segregation in communities?
The question means African American incomes, policies on African American incomes.
Yes, that's
okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. In fact, I do devote the chapter of the book to that. Although that's not a main focus of my work, but there were many labor market policies that were equally unconstitutional and discriminatory. Perhaps the most important one, and one that I was most familiar with, was that when the National Labor Relations Act was introduced by Senator Wagner during the New Deal, he included a provision in the National Labor Relations Act. I assume you know what the National Labor Relations Act does. It authorizes the federal government, the National Labor Relations Board, to grant exclusive bargaining rights to a union that represents a majority of employees in an industrial facility, and then similar provisions for trades, construction trades. When Senator Wagner introduced this bill in Congress in, I guess it was 1934, maybe he introduced it, it included a provision that said that the National Labor Relations Board could not certify a union for exclusive bargaining rights with employers if that union excluded African Americans from membership. That provision was removed in congressional debate. And as a result, the National Labor Relations Act was passed, empowering the National Labor Relations Board to grant exclusive bargaining rights to unions that excluded African Americans from membership. And unions did, particularly in the construction trades, exclude African Americans from membership. The first case in which the NLRB refused to certify a union for racial discrimination was not until 1964, I think it was. And it wasn't really implemented fully until the 1970s. So you had a situation where, and as you know, African Americans were excluded from the building trades, from the construction trades, excluded therefore from the best blue collar jobs during the big post-war boom, and the best jobs in terms of income and benefits that workers have had any time in American history. Well, that was another unconstitutional policy. Anytime the National Labor Relations Board certified a union for collective bargaining that excluded African Americans from membership, it was violating the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution by granting that kind of certification. And that's we did later adopt affirmative action requirements in civil rights laws that required those unions that had excluded African Americans to take special steps to recruit African Americans as apprentices and then as union members. But it was relatively ineffective because those unions also had seniority rules that first fired, last hired, that perpetuated the original unconstitutional exclusion in the same way, actually, that the wealth gap that was created by the unconstitutional housing policy continues to this day and has ongoing effects even after the policy was ended.
Right. Good. Thank you. The next question says, abolishing single-family zoning has been a proposed solution for the housing crisis in California. What are your views on that and whether it has any implication on removing what is known as de facto segregation?
Well, abolishing single-family zoning is a necessary first step. As I said earlier, if, for example, we're going to place low-income housing for low-income families in high opportunity neighborhoods. And, you know, the notion that somehow this means building high apartment towers is silly. There are many architectural designs of, townhouses, garden apartments, three-story apartments that fit right into a residential neighborhood. You couldn't tell that they were multi-family dwellings simply by looking at them from the outside. So that's a necessary first step. But abolishing single-family zoning is not going to itself deal with racial exclusion. As I indicated, you also need to deal with the lack of down payments that African Americans have because of the wealth gap So we need down payment assistance for them. We need even more aggressive affirmative action in housing in terms of discounted prices. Even if you built duplexes or triplexes, as recent attempts in California to provide under a single-family zoning reform bills, there's little chance that very many African Americans will be able to access those, because there's also a big housing shortage for tech workers, for young professionals who can't afford to live in the communities where they grew up. And they're the ones who will gobble up the somewhat lower priced housing that is created as a result of zoning reform. So we need zoning reform, certainly, as a step in the right direction. We can't do other things without it, but it itself is not going to significantly impact segregation.
Indeed, one member of the audience sends in a note about it relates to the wealth gap, saying housing's about pricing, not about just about a lack of housing. When a house costs $500,000 and a teacher makes $65,000, what that's a huge problem.
Well, yes, that is. And let me say this: we have a very distorted federal housing policy. We have subsidies only for low-income families. And as you just pointed out, middle-class families can't afford housing certainly in California in many cities. And you find teachers, nurses, construction workers driving long distances to get to the places where they work because they can't afford housing. We have no federal programs that subsidize housing that cannot be built under current market conditions for middle income families. And that's another area that needs to be as a first step towards desegregation. It itself won't solve the problem, but we can't solve it without some kind of subsidy program for the missing middle in housing policy.
So your book, and as I said, groundbreaking, and a lot of focus on the government. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the interplay between the government, and you can define that however you want, agency or the agency or various administrations, and the private sector, because I think that's an important component of this whole story. So I'd appreciate it if you could talk about that a bit more, and also just link that into you said that you're working on another book about solutions. I guess also, what are some of the impediments, the major impediments to solving some of these problems?
All right. Well, let me take those questions separately. I mentioned that I'm going to send you an article that I wrote recently, and maybe you saw it and published in the New York Times a few months ago, about what a local civil rights group could do. And I focused this article. It turns out I picked a community in California, but I could have written it about any place in the country. I picked a community in San Mateo in Northern California, which was created as an all-white neighborhood. In the 1940s, the home sold for about $100,000 in today's money. It's still all white. And with a little bit of research, I was able to identify and report it on the bank, the real estate agency, and the developer that, with the federal government's blessing, created that community as a segregated white community. Well, that bank, that real estate company, that developer are still around today. Their successors are around today. And their successors assumed their assets and liabilities, which include their moral liabilities. When they took over, the bank that financed that community as an all-white community is now part of Wells Fargo. The real estate agency that sold the homes in that all-white community is now part of Coldwell Banker. The developer still runs a big shopping center in that community. So those can be identified. The local civil rights group should be pressing those particular institutions to contribute to a fund to subsidize African Americans to move to the community that they themselves excluded them from with the blessing of the federal government in the mid-20th century. So the private sector has a great role to play in redressing this situation. What's the major obstacle? The major obstacle is lack of political support. We call it NIMBYs. And it's a particular dilemma politically because the Democratic Party today is a coalition of low income, disproportionately African American and Hispanic voters, and white suburbanites who will be the first ones to resist any effort to redress this. So we need civil rights groups to raise consciousness about it. We need to teach history differently in schools. The biggest obstacle is public opinion, and we need to change that. It's a political problem. It's not a problem of thinking of solutions.
Right. It's interesting because another question that just came in sort of dovetails with that was about white flight. And I mean, do you see any specific person wants to know, do you see any specific remedies to white flight?
Oh, sure. Sure. There are communities around this country. All the things that should be done are being done in some places by a few people, and it just needs to be much more widespread. There are down payment assistance funds, for example. There are places that have abolished exclusionary zoning. There are places that are doing a better job of placing a low-income housing tax credit or Section 8 vouchers in higher opportunity communities. And there are communities in transition that have stemmed white flight and preserved stable desegregation. Perhaps the best example is Oak Park, Illinois, where for many, many years now, they've had stable desegregation. It was an all-white suburb, that inner ring suburb to which African Americans moved, and there was initial white flight, but the community got together and stabilized it. It did some creative things. One thing it did was it created an insurance program to insure property values, so that whites wouldn't have to fear if they remained in their homes. Their property values would decline. And of course, the insurance program didn't have to pay out very much because property values don't decline when African Americans move in, unless there's blockbusting speculators that exploit the program. And that created much of the white flight in this country, in this country's history. So we couldn't implement those kinds of policies. Real estate agencies have a big role to play in assuring their customers that a diverse community is a healthy community. That's an important thing that you can't quantify, but if the real estate industry is mobilized in the community, it can stem white flight. And there are a number of other examples of places that have attempted and successfully to do it. Mount Airy, a suburb of Philadelphia, is another one that's been reasonably successful. So it can be done.
Right. I want to take you back to a Supreme Court 2007 Supreme Court case, parents involved, regarding the Seattle and Louisville school districts, which you said was a big instigator for you in this project. As you, I suspect, have learned over your research, in about 150 instances, the Supreme Court has overturned itself. Sometimes it's because social attitudes change. Brown versus Board of Education, after Plessy, or, cases involving Jehovah's Witnesses and the flag during the Second World War. So one of the things you were pointing out was that the ground level premise, or one of the ground level premises of that decision, was de facto segregation. Now you have mounted a case about de jure segregation. I was just curious if you know if any lawyers are thinking about trying to revisit that issue on the basis of new facts.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't hang out with lawyers too much. So I don't know of any lawyers who are doing it. But, public opinion leads the Supreme Court frequently. It's not the other way around. And I am confident that the Supreme Court will eventually change its view of this. But I think public opinion has to make some progress first. The Supreme Court is not going to lead public opinion. And when it tries, there's an enormous backlash to it, and it loses credibility. I'm sure you know, and maybe your students, I won't tell it. Do I need to tell the switch in time that saves 9 story?
Go right ahead.
Well, come on, this is your job. You're the law professor. Well, in the 1930s, the Supreme Court and 20s and teens, the Supreme Court took the view that the 14th Amendment really wasn't about extending full citizenship to African Americans. It was about protecting property rights. And in the 1930s, during the New Deal and prior to that, it struck down minimum wage laws, it struck down health and safety laws, it struck down child labor laws on the grounds that child labor law interfered with the ability, the right of children to negotiate with their employer for wages. And
speaking of myths.
Huh?
I said, speaking of myths.
Yeah, right. So this is the Supreme Court's view.
Yeah, I know.
And in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt won an enormous majority in re-election, and he threatened, after being re-elected, that he was going to expand the Supreme Court in order to get a majority that would not insist on this ridiculous interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And one Supreme Court justice got scared and decided, well, maybe the 14th Amendment doesn't prevent minimum wage and child labor laws and so forth. And, the legal scholars, maybe legal journalists, probably not scholars, call this the switch in time that saved nine. And the Supreme Court subsequently upheld minimum wage and various labor market regulations. So the same thing has happened without such a clever phrase many times in the Supreme Court's history. And it will happen again, but again, only under the press of a changed public opinion.
And of course, as you know, there are people now who are pressing to enlarge the size of the court for just the same reason that Roosevelt proposed it back at the time. We're at our end time. I would like to thank you very much on behalf of the school for coming here and giving us a great presentation on your wonderful book. And if you will send me those links or articles, I will see to it that they get to the students and other faculty members who have expressed an interest in reading them. And we will all look forward to your second book on remedies to this monumental problem.
Thank you very much, Henry.
Thank you.
Great seeing you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.
Take care.